Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Today is Wednesday, September 4th, 2024. We are gathered for an afternoon work session. Our topic for today is to get an update on our progress regarding the facilities master plan. My name is John Kafalis, Commissioner from District 1, currently the Chair of the Board of County Commissioners, joined by my Commissioner colleagues Kristen Stevens from District 2, Jody Shattuck McNally from District 3. We have our Assistant County Manager here, and I anticipate we'll have our County Manager here momentarily. With that, I believe we should turn it over to our Facilities Director. Welcome, sir. Welcome to your team, and we look forward to the conversation.
Very good. Thank you, Commissioners. Great to have the time with you each today. And I'll just quickly share, Jen Johnson and I work in facilities together. Sydney and Chelsea are with CRB and helping lead us through the master plan effort.
And as famous as you are, good sir, would you identify yourself for the record?
Sorry, Ken Cooper.
Thank you.
Part of the facilities team.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And you'll see a series of slides that pretty much capture where we're headed with the process. There's been data gathering since we kicked this off end of second quarter this year, and we're anticipating wrapping it up yet this year, roughly. So we'll talk about that. As a quick kind of a backdrop, the county went through a full-blown process in 2017 and 18, and been pretty closely following that plan, right? It spelled out about $600 million worth of future needs, which we've tackled over a quarter of already in a relatively short time. So it's really a blessing that we've been able to, get ahead of those kind of things, and impressive for the county to have had the resources and the commitment to dive right in and really start to go after, a good number of those projects, the jail project certainly, but there are, a good number of others as well. Toward the end of 2019, the county went forward with a possibility to get some money with a ballot measure that the voters did not support at the end of 2019. So in the early part of 2020, Sydney, and then it was Amy Tabor at that time, who was retired, but Sydney worked with us and helped push forward kind of an abbreviated version of the master plan. So we intended to do a more full-blown update like we're doing this time. But in the wake of that failed ballot measure, the commissioners at the time asked that we sort of move quickly and still try. And the focus at that time was community justice alternatives, criminal justice at that time. So that was done pretty quickly, but it only touched on a smaller portion of the county. This process will be a full-blown, or is a full-blown, revisit. So a good number of the departments and offices in the county have not seen a formal update since 2018, right? So this process is going to be, much more inclusive than that one, all inclusive, compared to what we did in 2020. Just the only other comment is kind of an obvious thing, but obviously COVID happened, early 2020, and we've seen actually positive impact from a space need standpoint. You guys are aware of that, of course. Some of the groups that we'll talk about a little bit today have seen, some pretty positive changes in terms of remote work and reducing back the sort of the hurriedness of having to get in front of, a good number of other capital projects. So that's really been a helpful thing as well. So I don't want to steal too much of it, but at this point, I'll just turn it back over here to Sydney, and she and Chelsea are going to take you through the slides and, ask along with questions that you might have. I don't know if you have anything right off the bat that you might want to ask, or we can dive right in.
I don't. It's just that if folks would introduce themselves for the record. Colleagues, do you have any questions at this time? Please proceed.
Great. So I'm Sydney Hamilton with CRB. I'm joined by my colleague.
My name is Chelsea Stramel with CRB.
And that's an acronym. What is CRB?
Oh, gosh.
Clark Richardson
Thank you.
Biscuit.
That is our employer. We're a consulting team that was brought on. I was previously involved, as Ken mentioned, with the previous master plan and the master plan update in 2020. So the continuity, I think, has been certainly something that I've enjoyed having, and I hope that that was a value that I was able to bring to the county, and will continue as we continue to move through this. So today's update is quite simply an update in where we are in the process. We are not asking for any decisions from the three of you today. It is purely informational. That being said, if you have questions, feel free to interject. We don't need to have a formal question and answer period at the end, although we will reserve time for questions as needed. All right. Oh, there we go. Okay. So 3 primary sections for today. We'll give you a brief overview of the process to date and the overall process that we'll continue through as we finish out the project, how we've collected data, who's been included in the process, recapping the progress to date. Then we'll discuss primarily in the second section, which will be the bulk of our discussion today, will be the findings to date, where we are, some survey results and some projections and a couple of case studies for how we're going to move forward with space planning for the remaining steps in the process. And then we'll talk a little bit about what comes after today. So as I mentioned, the desired outcomes for this meeting are primarily to give you an update on where we are, talk about what's going to happen next, and as I said, there's no recommendations or requests from you at this time. So our approach to this project is outlined in this image above. We held a kickoff at the beginning of the project. We gathered all the stakeholders we had representatives from all the different departments come and be part of that kickoff meeting because we want to make sure it's comprehensive. We want to solicit feedback from everybody who will be affected by the project recommendations. We went through some background information at that time, and then we aligned on a number of goals moving forward, and I'll go into more detail on that in a minute. And we also at that point distributed a series of questionnaires that were given to each department, and the department heads completed those, and I'll show you some results from that. Then we moved into about 3.5 weeks worth of interviews. We held interviews with each of the department representatives. We discussed changes that have taken place since 2018, any new information. A lot of focus was placed on how they are now working, changes since 2018. Mostly those are related to remote work and technology implementation through COVID. There were some other topics, but that certainly was the bulk of it. We did a little bit of benchmark research, and then we went into the analysis, and then we started to work on the Space Needs Program. We have since presented a review document to each of those departments, so they were each able to review the data that we captured from each of them, and they provided feedback in case we misunderstood anything. And the next steps will be to finalize those edits, and we will present an interim report. Again, it is primarily some findings, not yet putting forth recommendations. We will then start working on finalizing the space needs projections and bringing forth some alternatives to the county. So ways to meet what we're projecting the space needs are going to be in the next 20 years. We will present some alternatives in an in-person workshop here at downstairs in the building. Again, same group of stakeholders are anticipated to attend that workshop. They will be able to work interactively with us through a variety of options, right? We're not yet presenting recommendations. We're working through what could be solutions, and they will have the opportunity to workshop through those with us, talk through the pros and cons of each option, why why one direction might work better for one department than another, those kinds of things. And then we'll refine those based on the outcome of that meeting, and those will become the final recommendations in the report. And we're anticipating a mid-December, I believe, delivery
One
date for
moment,
that.
please, Sydney. I just want to acknowledge that our county manager has now joined us, Lorinda Volker. Thank you, Lorinda.
Thanks.
Please continue, Sydney.
I'll add one quick thing in terms of the process we're following, and it's really the only kind of, it's not even a significant change, but it's something that's a little bit of a wrinkle from the last time we went through this in 2017 and 18. And that's that the final report will have a focus on changes that are coming, things that are needed, et cetera, from a square footage standpoint. We didn't put in as much focus on on the building assessment piece, because we've done a good job of staying ahead of that. The county has done a good job of reinvesting and so on, like we've talked about many times. But in addition to that, because of the volatility of the construction market, which is actually it's actually stabilized some since we, kind of kicked this thing off. But we're not going to put a focus on the dollars attached to it like we did so much in 2018. So that'll be a little bit of a change to what you would have seen. But other than that, Sydney mentioned the continuity. It's been terrific. Having her help lead this thing has been great. There's familiarity with our own departments. There's familiarity from them with her, with the process, with the steps, et cetera. So that's a big plus. So sorry to kind of jump in there, but I think that's helpful to know that.
Yeah, no, that's a good clarification. There was a conditions assessment performed as part of the 2018 plan, and I think that we are able to use that document still in this plan. We have not updated any conditions assessments. Any other questions on this before I move on?
Colleagues, do you have any questions? Commissioner Stevens?
So are we not attaching dollar amounts because we don't know the timeline for when we're going to get things done, and because it fluctuates so much, and what would be the reason for that?
That's the gist of it, really, is that when you focus so much on the dollars, it sometimes inaccurately describes the need, right? And so it felt to us like if we look at this thing in 6 months from now or in 18 months from now, we would go, well, this, it doesn't apply anymore, right? You might remember, in fact, at the end of the process in 18, I think I've talked about this before in front of this board. We were thrilled, worked with the budget office, worked with the county manager's office and the board. We were thrilled to add in at that time, what was once a historical escalation rate, inflation rate on construction of 3% roughly. We were thrilled to get 6% added in. Well, 6% was about a third or less of what we would have needed, had we had a crystal ball. And so that's the kind of thing, Commissioner, that we're just we can pretty closely tell you what 50,000 square feet is going to be, right? From a cost standpoint. But as we go forward with it, we wanted to have the focus be more on the needs from a square footage standpoint, from opportunities that are ways to save against square footage, things like that, versus this huge, let's call it 600 million, because that's what it was in 2018. So I hope that answers your question. It's kind of a roundabout answer, but it's a very good question.
No, it does, and that's what I had assumed, but I think that you're right. We can always plug in a number when we need to kind of, when we're ready to kind of start moving on some of these projects, but I don't know how useful it is now either, so, thank you.
The most recent activities that we've done, you'll recall the studies that we had done for the judicial, piece of it for the county's needs. Those numbers were, very, very high, right? The impact of having to do that project, even in the sort of the smaller scale, was in the ballpark of 150 million. And so, again, that number doesn't count anymore. And so it makes it very tough when those become a place in time and you kind of hang on to them as something you can kind of count on, because unfortunately we haven't been able to count on those numbers. It's made it really challenging, not just us, obviously, anybody that works in this industry, to try to stay ahead of it. And so it just felt to us, after a lot of conversations, like it made more sense to look at it more from a needs standpoint on the needs and opportunities for ways to save, but also, to have information that says, okay, here's the square footage. What's the new number that's attached to that? I think that's an important piece. So.
And I think that data did not help to prioritize any of the projects. It was just information that was almost immediately outdated. So we've talked a lot about this process, really understanding how our space needs have changed, what the best practices look like versus how we're functioning today, what do departments want to do that's probably someplace in between, and then begin to prioritize based on readiness of a department, on the who they need to sit next to, where it helps to have a connected think HR and finance. Wouldn't it be great if they were sitting in, where they could talk to each other a little better? Those kind of opportunities, I think, are where we'll focus.
We could even do a, sort of, I say quick and dirty, but, our team internally could do something, looking at, the number of square feet that we may be talking about eventually. And by, let's say, June of '25, here's what we think it'd be, for all that, or for any of the specific projects. So that's kind of where we're at. And by doing so, we would be using the most recent data that we had from the most recent project. So there's value there too. So.
So if I may, just as a quick follow-up to that conversation, I'm understanding that when we identify a particular project that we actually give the green light to go forward, let's say June 2025, there's some kind of capital improvement project, then we would get numbers and develop a budget well ahead in advance to be able to make an informed decision. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it would be the most recent information that we would have, so we would hopefully be as accurate as we possibly could be, rather than to look back at something that happens, at the end of '24. By, let's say, third quarter of '25, it's already, 12% off. I'm praying that doesn't happen, but honestly, that would have been, the case for the last 5 years or so, so.
Well, and again, to your team's credit, I mean, all the projects we've done in the last few years have either been at budget or below, below the budget, and, a little bit of exception, but the construction inflation thing is a pretty tricky variable.
Thank you, yeah. Our team has done a great job with it. It's been painful, but, trying to stay within and trying to even, you might recall even, Commissioner, when behavioral health was going to happen, right? We had to build layers of contingency into that thing to get us from September 1st to September 15 when when the board finally was able to approve that. So that was kind of the worst of it at that time. Fortunately and gratefully we're not at that point, but that's not to say that something couldn't happen that, would push us back in there. So it sounds like your understanding of it in terms of the support for it, but that's a significant change from what we did in 18. But I think that given the familiarity that we have, given the number of experiences that we have doing projects, it's been a blessing to be able to tackle so many. I think that we feel good about our ability to, to more accurately represent what it might be, coming in 8 months or 12 months or whatever than it would be to put this thing in and say, here you go, here's the number. I think we feel better about it, so.
I agree.
Thank you. Let's proceed.
Quickly, these are the participants who've been involved at this point. So essentially, very comprehensive. All of the departments within the county have been included. I'm not going to go through this entire list. You have it printed in front of you. If you have any questions, feel free to shout it out, but intended to represent that everyone is included. And then these are the lists of buildings that we toured following those interviews. We did have to skip a few. They were during the height of the fire, but we have drawings of everything, so we have been able to tour them virtually in many ways.
It looks like in that picture, we're using state-of-the-art communication
State-of-the-art
technology.
That's right, that's right.
That must be part of our Zoom workplace. Okay, no,
This was taken at the community corrections.
Right.
Please, just kidding, just keep going.
So,
Just want to say, Commissioner, I have one of those in my house because sometimes with my poor broadband and internet service, that's the only phone that works. And I'm not kidding.
So in that kickoff session that I mentioned earlier, we prioritized a couple of goal-setting exercises, the first of which was to revisit the goals that were set at the time 2017, what came out of the 2018 report. We revisited the goals and started by asking, how much progress have you made on each of these goals? And the participants were able to provide feedback and kind of rank where they stood on each of these goals. And you can see, as Ken kind of alluded, a lot of the projects that came out of that set of recommendations in 2018 have since been addressed. And then the second question was, regarding those same goals, how many of them are still of great import as we move forward with this update? And so we were able to rank those. And I think no surprises on this slide. It reflects that a lot of the projects that were high priority then have since been addressed by Ken and his team. And so those are now lower priority because they no longer need to be addressed. They have been addressed. I think it's worth noting that the goals that were still of great importance were being good service providers to the constituents within the county. That's a top one. Customer service and serving the county being the top couple of goals. And then there was a lot of talk about changes in the workflow now since 2018. So then we said, okay, well, what goals are we going to need now moving forward? What's changed? What do we need to add to our list of goals? And there were sort of 10 goals that rose to the top of the list. All of these are important, and these are all considerations as we move forward in 2024. So a lot of talk about, again, the way that workflow has changed since 2020 and since COVID, and some of the technology that we're now able to use, both in terms of work, where we work, but also how services are provided. A lot of our constituents are now accessing services remotely, and not having to come physically in person to county buildings to achieve them. I wasn't planning to go through this list one by one. You do have it in front of you. Do you have any questions on this before I move on?
Colleagues, any questions or feedback regarding these 2024 goals? Yes, Commissioner.
So a lot is, I always try to look back at the last 4 years and think about the circumstances that, were out of control have kind of forced us or opened the doors or made people more open to flexibility and innovation and change instead of always the ways we've done things. And I see some of those things up there, remote learning or flexible space or, some of those ideas. And also maybe going back to being more of a helping support a work balance, life balance in those ways. So, and I guess I'm addressing this to all of you. A couple of questions. First, with this new master plan, what is the innovative new ideas that have emerged to kind of look at the future of the planning of the space? And secondly, what is really difference from the first plan to this plan in regards of the need, like those top needs that have really emerged from this challenging time, kind of the lemon, I guess the lemonade's made out of the lemons, I guess.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll try to answer the last half of it first, and that would be a couple of them that stand right out. In the 18 master plan, this building was going to need a supplement, so basically a second admin services building would have been required to keep up with the trend line of growth in this building across the groups that operate here. That was inside of a 10-year window, so that would be only probably 3 or 4 years away now that we would be looking at, another, let's call it, 150,000 square foot building or something, large, right? Even 75,000 would be a huge number. So that now is very much clearly on the back burner instead of being right on the front burner. We actually had in the strategic plan that followed it was about the same time as the end of the master plan was the first years of that strategic plan. But there was actually a line item, Commissioner Cavallis might remember this, that we closed that out pretty early as a piece of what the strategic plan called for. And that related specifically to having to find a way to basically just squeeze back square foot per person in this building. And so that was one project. The other one that stands out, Jen can talk about this a little bit more as well. Human Services really quickly in COVID made a change to their service model where they went from, which is now kind of like a 2.5 to 1, right? Close enough for persons per office kind of deal instead of a 1-to-1. So that project as well was identified in the 2018 master plan as a roughly 50,000 square foot facility, an expansion / sort of a redo at Blue Spruce at the campus there. And that project now also is not, something that's on the front burner anymore. So those are two that really stand out. There's pockets within this building, specifically IT for sure. Other groups that finance is another one, that HR is another that have more fully adopted, the ability to do some more remote work, and so that's softened the need for growth within this building by department. So. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, Ken, I think you spoke very well to it, and I'm sure commissioners, you've probably heard some stories, from the Director of Human Services and others that represent that group. But certainly, since 2018 and 2020, Human Services has vacated 24,000 square feet. And rather than growing the 50,000 that we had talked about back in 18. So they do have a very different business model where they are sharing. It's closer to 3-to-1, but they have kind of like 3 main days as we understand it, where folks report, and then there's kind of 2 floaters. So it's hard to really gauge, but they've gone to a very neat, I think, very well-used reservation system through Zoom. So all spaces are basically reservable, whether they're office or a workstation or a conference room or whatever, drop in, whatever it may be. So,
And it seems like both here, as we've done all the renovation here on the second floor, for example, and also at the Human Services Building on Blue Spruce, been very creative about renovating, redesigning that space and not necessarily adding, but redesigning, reconfiguring it so it's more
Yeah.
effective in terms of how we provide services. So I think we've been successful.
Yeah.
Those two examples, I think, are indications of success.
Yeah, and I think that begins to answer Commissioner Shattuck McNally's earlier question, or kind of the first part of her question was about kind of the technology and ideas that have generated, since that time. And I think a lot of it is to do with, sort of creativity within remote space, right, or within unassigned space. IT has a lot of that, and has had a lot of that actually pre-COVID, and it's been used kind of as a model. There's some spaces at Blue Spruce that go way back 10 years ago, I think, Jen, that were also kind of early versions of what could be done more creatively to provide not assigned space, but places that people could collaborate, come in and sort of, hotel or, whatever that could look like. So I think those are things, Commissioner Shattuck McNally, that are part of what, we certainly anticipate. We haven't talked about it quite a lot yet, but there is an upcoming a workshop that we're going to involve again, in person with all the directors' offices represented, where we'll talk through these kind of things and begin to look at opportunities for a little bit more of that. Obviously, those things happen, with some time and money, so it isn't a simple, snap of the fingers and people immediately have those kind of changes. Sometimes you can invest pretty good money, but we feel good about some of the changes you guys just saw this past weekend, the changes over in elections. I think that's a good example of, certainly identifying some ways to consolidate from 3 to 2, in space, but also in buildings, I should say. But Jen and her team did an outstanding job of implementing things that make that process way, way smoother. Feels better for the employees, daylight, all those things that you want to roll into projects that they're not, like, wow, look what we did kind of thing, but more just, opportunities to really change and improve where you can. And we appreciate the support, financially to get those done, so.
I would add one more thing, sorry, if I could, just, the technology. I mean, we are so reliant on the driver of technology to what we could do for facilities. So it felt like almost an overnight shift. I mean, when we, pressured to, allow folks to work away from the office, it became something that folks embraced more so. I think it was just so difficult for many to change the traditional way they, reported to work, so to say. But the technology was so quick to, the uptake it felt very quick, at least on my user end, and, to distribute to the entire workforce. So I think that's a big driver. We were relying on that innovation really for our facility changes.
So
I would only add one more thing. It
And,
looks like
and,
you
and
have a
just,
question.
I want to remind us that we've gone through 1/3 of the presentation,
Yeah.
and we are halfway through our time allotment, just to be mindful of that, please.
I'll be quick, and it isn't meant to be a wet blanket, but it might sound that way a little bit. But in a recent conversation that Jen Johnson and I had with Human Services Director Heather O'Hare, she was being very wisely cautious, I think, about the fact that, okay, right now, we may need to pump the brakes just a little bit, right? We don't know fully, 4 years out from COVID, what the real impact is going to be. Schools don't know yet, right? Those things are all, maybe 5 years away from really having something that says, okay, here's what it looked like. So that could, I think the county has done a very good job of not hurrying into a bunch of changes that, that would have, completely changed things and flipped it on its ear. We've been cautious about that. And so I hope that helps, at least in terms of, we're not hurrying into things that make it so that we'd be right away coming back in and undoing it, right? So, thank you.
And I want to just point out that incorporating climate responsive design, I'm very glad that is in there. And I look forward to hearing more details of how we're continue to make progress on that front.
Great.
Please continue.
All right, no problem. So findings to date, these are some high-level results from the survey that we distributed to all the departments. I think it's important to note that 80% of the participants, the departments, noted that their employees are working away from their desk either because they're out in the field or because they are working remotely. And that is a big shift. I think field-based work has not been a huge shift for most departments. I think a couple maybe a little bit more. An example I'll give there is that some data entry is now happening in the field, whereas before, fleet, for example, might have done all of their data entry at a workstation. Now they're doing that through tablets in other locations within buildings or road and bridge, for example, out in the field. The greater percentage of that 80 is the participants who are now working remotely in some capacity or other. That was certainly not the case in 2017. Nor in 2020 when we did the update. The main reason that people say they need to be in person in their buildings is for collaboration with their colleagues or for interaction with members of the public. That is the primary driver for coming into the building. And so that starts to inform, I think this is a little bit of an answer to the question you are asking, which is what type of space do we need to be planning for when we consider the county's space needs? We are seeing a trend, and this is something that we've been seeing since even before COVID, a trend for not necessarily reducing desk space, but replacing the ratio of desk space with a higher ratio of collaborative space. 4/5 of the departments say that they are serving members of the public who still come here in person to obtain services. So we do still need to maintain a significant physical presence for members of the public. There is a bit of a shift toward members of the public who maybe don't have either access to or a comfort level with some of the technology use, but not in all cases. There are still some services that can only be obtained in person. And then the last note here is about changes since the 2018 plan. People who feel like they are in the right location, or at least their suite, their department is in the right location. That is up at 80%, and it's worth noting that in 2018, 2017, technically, 3 of the 5 departments who are still saying that they have trouble have shifted to saying they are now in the right location, those being the coroner, the EOC, and community development. I think community development, that's more of a shift in leadership and a perception of how services are provided for them since they have not physically relocated. The other 2 have new locations. The 2 that are saying they still need improvement are extension, which we'll talk about a little bit, and then human services. Human services talked quite a bit about the potential for like a mobile service. And the population that they are having trouble reaching is the more remote population. And so their answer here being not in the right location has to do with reaching the people who need them versus bringing them to their services. So I think that will be part of our planning as well. Any questions on that before we move on?
I'd like to suggest we move along and maybe try to save some time at the end.
Okay, absolutely.
Conversation.
I hear you. Quick overview. This is a snapshot from the 2018 document. This was the recommended list of projects and the timeline for implementing those projects. And the stars indicate the projects that either are now complete, blue stars for those that are in progress, the light green is for those that are planned, and the darker green is projects that can now be reconsidered primarily based on changes in workflow, whether that be due to COVID or something else. I think it's worth noting that the only project that doesn't have a star by it is the Justice Center, so that has not been addressed in any significant way, nor are we planning to reconsider again for what would now be a 4th time what we think their planning needs would be. I think that project, their needs have been studied thoroughly. We are not planning to make any significant changes to the recommendations for the Justice Center at this time.
So you might recall, we did hire a separate company to work with the courts and our staff to sort of figure out what they do need, and we feel like we have what we need. We explored that far more than we explored the master plan in general, so we feel very comfortable right now.
Yeah.
Great.
Very quickly, there's a little note on there for me. This headcount information is in progress. A number of departments are still calculating their current headcount. So I've indicated here where we in 2018 projected the headcount would be at this time. we did not have a projection for specifically the year 2024, so I'm giving you the range that we had predicted. The number that you see there under the 2024, which indicates that it is in review, that number will increase, and I anticipate that we will find that we are right in the range that was predicted for this time frame. The point of this slide is simply to say that the headcount projection method that we used in 2017, what came out in the 2018 report, is the method that we are still going to be using to project the headcount. Essentially, we right-sized it, and then we project at a rate that was based on historic growth at 1.9%. So that's the projection that we used in 2017. We believe that it was a valid approach then, and we're going to use that again for this project. Yep.
Yes.
So I have a question, I mean, this is for the county manager and also for you. That's head count on employees, so it's showing a growth. So is that based on, so I guess for both, is that based on some of your projections on the needs and what we think we'll need for employees for serving the population? Or is this kind of a standard number for projecting organizations of our size for that space? And I always think about that, and I think, okay, more employees, that's great, we're serving folks, but then I also think how, with knowing we have some cuts coming up in this time frame, I'm thinking, how are we paying, we increase those headcounts, but also, that's increased space or changes in space, but also salary. So I'm just curious about how that all interplays.
So you're right. We're not projecting how many employees we will think we need in terms of operation. This is kind of a population standard for space planning so that we have a growth factor in. It doesn't mean we will grow by that, or that we have to grow by that, or that we'll grow at all. But there has to be some sort of guess as our population grows, how many more people will we need in human services? How many more deputies will we need? What about open space?
So this doesn't take into consideration budget. I think this is kind of what
That's right.
Commissioner Shattuck McNally was getting at, budget consideration. This methodology is sort of separate from that?
That's correct. That's correct. I think there were two departments that already knew, based on budget approval, what their headcount is going to be next year, and we did take into account when departments that knew that number. Otherwise, we are using the same methodology. I think it is worth noting that in 2018, you had fewer employees than you now have, and you have grown at about the rate that we predicted you would. And your rate, this is not a industry standard rate. We do not apply the same 1.9% to every county organization. It varies from county to county. Population growth is certainly a factor. But because it appears to have been an accurate rate in 2017, we're going to use that same rate.
Thank you.
Good clarification. Budget is not a factor in that number, no. And so I think this will start to answer your question as well about what innovations are we using in the methodology for planning. So in 2017, when we did the plan, we had essentially one method for projecting space. We drilled into each department's space needs and space use, and then we kind of right-sized for each department and then projected out based on their headcount growth. We now know, because things are changing very quickly, technology is changing very quickly, we need to build in a little bit more flexibility. And we had a lot of flexibility then, but we're building in even more now. And so we're bringing forth a series of planning scenarios. And I can say that since 2020, other government organizations that I've worked with to do planning, a lot of them doing so because of COVID and space use implications, there are usually two primary drivers. One is we're no longer seeing everybody come to the office every day. Why do we need this much space? And then the other is usually someone at the head of the organization saying, I don't want to pay all the money for all this real estate. And so you have the real estate driver, and then you have the actual work process driver. And you never want one or the other to be the only informing factor. You need it to be both. I would argue that how the department's work should have a little bit more weight and a little more bearing than just the real estate. And so that's what we're trying to achieve here. And we've seen that through other projects where, maybe it's going to be somebody at the top said, I need you to eliminate X number of square feet. I don't think that's always the right way to go. I think it needs to be somewhere in the middle. So that's what we're intending to achieve with these 3 different planning scenarios. So we have a baseline scenario, which is where we are today, how much space we're currently using, and how are we using it. And then planning scenario number 1 is essentially saying, if we moved forward at a status quo, the way that you're currently assigning space, 1 desk to 1 person in most cases, human services being a bit of an exception, what would that look like? And I don't think that's the right planning method, right? I think you would all agree with me, but it's a good way to have a gap analysis comparison to say, if we did so, what would it look like? This is how we planned in the 2018 report. How does that compare now? And then the 2 scenarios that I think will be the actual planning scenarios, and I think there will be a combination of the 2 and a little bit of nuance between the 2 for each department. Scenario 2 is based on how they think they will be working in the next 10 years, 5 years, 10 years, many of which are talking about their teleworking implications, their remote work implications. And then scenario 3 is what we're calling the persona method. And this is a method that has been in use for, I think, like 20 years. It actually came from Silicon Valley and how users were like using interface in their devices, and it translated into space planning, and it's a really common methodology now used for space planning, and I'll walk through what that means. So the persona method is a method that, as I mentioned, it's been in use for a number of years. You kind of put together a series of user types, and you figure out how each of those user types use the space within your buildings. This is not a personality test. It's not about, who's outgoing and is chatting with their colleagues and who is sitting at their desk. And it is really just based on how people use space. And so this personas will vary from organization to organization. This is not like a Myers-Briggs. We tailor the persona types to each group. And for Larimer County, we identified 6 different persona types. We know from past work with the county that there are 2 primary user groups within the county, one that's very public facing and then another that's more internal services driven. And so we started there, and then we looked at who is working remotely, who is working in the office, and why is that the case? Are they in person because, say, there is a particular equipment type that they can't bring home and do in their work in the living room? Is it because they have a preference for being in person? Is it because of the type of people they're serving within the public? So you can see how we identified in the matrix below what each of those 6 persona types, how they fall into play. The first 3 being public facing, and then a combination of being either in person or site specific. And you can see I have some examples of each group. And then the second half, the second 3 of the 6, being more internal facing. And then from there, we take those and for each individual department, we examined what we think the breakdown is, the percentage breakdown by persona type. How many in each department fit into persona A, B, C, D, E, et cetera. And so I'm going to bring to you 4 case studies today to use as examples of how we're going to apply those space planning methodologies and how we're going to end up with a bit of a combination of things between the 2. So the first case study example is extension, CSU extension. You can see their head count above and how much they're going to be growing. In scenario 1, as I mentioned, we're just planning like we would have in 2018, 1 person, 1 desk, what's the space need? And you can see the space growth at 46% is right in line with the staffing growth projection of 46%. 46% is going to be across the board because we're applying the 1.9 to everybody. So you'll see that across all 4 of the case study examples. In scenario 2, where we are looking at how they are saying they work now, we know the kind of remote work that they're currently using, what their space need would be if that was the case. So we applied a slightly smaller square foot per person because we're assuming some desk sharing would be happening for that group. And you can see that if we projected their growth here on the second line here, they really wouldn't need to grow by much at all. They could grow in place if they implemented some space sharing within their existing suite. And they're a good example to use for the third example because, as they mentioned, they are not necessarily in the right location for the people that they serve. So they're probably a group that we're going to be discussing some options for relocating their suite. And so if we applied the third scenario, which is thinking a little bit more aggressively about their seat sharing, but with a really strict understanding of the type of, they have, for example, a kitchen demo space that they use very heavily within their suite, and that's a necessary space that can't be done in the living room. That's an important consideration for their suite moving forward. But you can see that we're projecting long-term, they actually don't need quite as much space as they currently have if they could implement some additional seat sharing. And so that starts to give us a range, if we move their group, of how much space we think they actually need moving forward. Yeah.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Thank you. So just so I make sure I understand this, which I'm really excited about, if we just stayed on our current status quo, how we build space, knowing they're going to grow, they would need 46% more space, and we'd have to build a bigger space.
Correct.
But with these other two scenarios or options and taking more data-driven analysis of what they really need and kind of the things they do, those numbers are dramatically different and a different recommendation. Am I reading, am I understanding that?
Yes, you're spot on.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. And we did check with each of these four groups. We gave the information to them because they knew, or so that they would know that they were, kind of being highlighted for today without necessarily being at the table with us. But clearly, this is not meant to be, hey, here's what we're going to do. It's a series of opportunities that we're going to have in future discussions in the coming workshop. So it's all going to be, nuanced by the fact that there's going to be heavy involvement from the user groups, right, to be able to help determine this. But as Cindy was saying, though, you already see the things that they're anticipating and that they're seeing in their own changes are going to help us as well. So it's a combination of those things, and that's why there's three different scenarios that are spelled out that, that each can kind of, be a helpful foundation for those conversations, so.
Yeah. And, it's not my job to tell anyone else how to do their job, but I want to present the data to say, if you worked in a certain way, you might be able to use your space a little bit differently. And, as Jen mentioned, for Heather in Human Services, there were some real budget implications to the amount of space that they were using, and that was an impetus for working the way that they do today. So I think it's important to be able to just illustrate that as a talking point to these groups, and then they make the decision.
We can move through these next pretty quickly, I think, in terms of the others that were highlighted
Yep.
for case studies. But I don't know if you have other questions about it at all, or Sydney, if you wanted to highlight any of the pieces. Again, it's these three scenarios applied to the four different groups, and gives you kind of a fundamental look at what we're going to be discussing with them, going forward. Go
Just
ahead,
to
Commissioner.
further clarify, and I appreciate your question, because now I understand it a little bit better. But the numbers, the actual numbers represent square footage?
Yes.
Per,
Yep.
per person? What, no?
No, per group. This is their overall footprint. This is the amount of space that they are using. So the illustration here, this is how much square footage
The IT department would
suite
need.
currently has. This is how much they are currently occupying.
Okay.
And if we were to project out based on their space, based on the status quo, right, they would continue to grow to quite a large suite of a little more than 17,000 square feet. However, they know that they don't need that much space. They have very much acknowledged that they are remote working. They are remote working more than probably anyone else within the county, and they are very aware of it.
Okay.
And so this is what we're saying they actually need to continue doing their work. Yes.
Thank you. Got
It's
it.
kind of what I mentioned earlier, too, is that we haven't gone through and sort of sweepingly changed a bunch of offices or wiped them out, or taken them away. It doesn't make sense to do that. It's really expensive to do that, and then you're kind of building back right away, potentially. So there are vacancies within some of these spaces, pretty considerable, right? IT, you guys walk up there and see, the number of folks that are actually in a space is sometimes, very, very small, so, yeah.
So this is very intriguing, but when I think about someone working remotely, and I think back to when the first year we had given out stipends for employees to have for better, for seats and making sure they had,
Right.
ergonomically
Yep.
correct seats and monitors or whatever to help them have a good workspace at work. So is that included in some of this? Would that be a policy thing? Are we still looking to support employees with that? And is that included in some of these projections that we're, it might not be the space and the energy, but are we supporting them with making sure that they, because right now what I'm sitting on is a bad chair, and that's probably why I feel bad at the end of the day, because I don't bring down my good chair. So I'm just curious, is that also built into these projections and these ideas?
Yeah, the projections you're seeing are county space, right? So what you're talking about with making sure that they have good ergonomics at home, I think, is what you're talking about for the remote work. That's inclusive of this, but it's not identified in here as additional space needs because it's not our space need. It's something that people use, 80% of the time, or, whatever that looks like. But it's not identified as a component of the square footage that's needed, because then you're talking about home office space. So I think
this would be decreasing the capital needs and the space, but maybe, and maybe some operating costs because people are not here using less water and electricity or whatever, but there might be the cost of equipment for homes. So, but we don't know that. That's not included in this calculation.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's really not a part of this study, other than to say that it continues to support those things, right? Those are things that were implemented after COVID, or during and after COVID. We're not looking to pull away or pull back on any of them. We're only trying to maximize, the opportunity. And again, we don't want you to get too fixated on the reduction numbers, because some of them are pretty significant, right? It's only, these are numeric, equations that come out of the persona piece that Sydney described, and you have that, I think, in front of you on a slide for, to take back if you have questions about it. But it helps to kind of, it gives you a possibility to look a little more, to look anew at space needs, right? And at space per person needs, and I think that's kind of the primary get from this.
Okay,
So.
thank you. I appreciate it.
I believe Lorenda wanted to say something.
Yeah.
Just briefly, I think, so one of the critical pieces is going to be the budget piece. What do we do with this information when this is all wrapped up? And so this idea of mandatory remote workers and the stipend that they get to set up their office is something we have in place. We'll want to look at it and see if it still makes sense. It probably does. We'll want to modernize it as best we can. But taking advantage of these vacant spaces, so let's say we do reduce IT down to a much smaller footprint, we have empty space there, so it's like putting a puzzle together. It costs money, though, to move another office into that space, but we vacate another space that might create another opportunity. So it's like dominoes, and that's, I think, what we're at the very beginning of understanding what's possible, and then we'll decide how to spend money to make that happen. What we won't need, it looks like, is another administrative services building, which is a very expensive way of providing space. So, but even taking advantage of these spaces is not free, and we'll have to talk about that as a capital program.
In general, for facilities, the longer you wait to decide something like this, the better you do it, right? Because you wait for things that change, on the business model. That's not to say that we want to drag our feet. We try not to do that. But to Lorenda's point, there's no hurry to go in and kind of just, just sweep it. So I think that the way it'll be staggered, and Lorenda used dominoes as an example, but it'll show a series of options that we can consider. The 2018 study did the same thing. So it'll give you options to consider. Won't have to likely rush into any of them, but it'll just be things that we can start to, to keep our eyes on and be able to pick off. So,
Yeah. And the 2018 plan also identified a timeline for sort of buying time in this building while
Right.
groups continue to grow. So that those kinds of things will be considered here. Very quickly, I just want to point out the space in scenarios 2 and 3 for IT are the same because they are already operating at a way that the persona method sort of validated. For the emergency management group, again, slightly different implication to the scenarios, which is we're not going to grow their space to 13,000 square feet. That wouldn't make any sense for them. That being said, if they remote worked at the rate that they're describing, they would lose space that they currently have. We don't think that that's really appropriate. But if we were to use the persona method with them, the understanding is that the space they have is appropriate. It's going to be appropriate for the long term. And so that persona method shakes out to be equal to what they currently have. then there's a fourth one in there that I won't go into since we're running out of time. Very quickly, this is the remaining timeline. We're kind of right here at the preliminary findings work session, right here. And so the remaining timeline leading out to mid to late December, we'll be having the stakeholder workshop that I mentioned, where we'll go through these options, the implications, understanding the pros and cons of different ways of addressing space need and shuffling the musical chairs and the dominoes, as we described. Out of that, we will have a set of recommendations, which we'll put forth in a draft, and then we'll have a final presentation. I believe that's it. There is a little summary of the workshop on the last page, but I don't think we need to look at that.
Is the alternatives workshop something that would be advisable for us to attend, or any of us, or not necessarily?
I think I will leave that up to you.
That might be getting into the weeds a little
Right.
bit.
I
Okay.
think what happened last year at that workshop was really candid discussions about space, where supervisors and managers could disagree with each other about what they thought their space needs might be, and then have the experts in the room to sort of talk about these personas and why they're, what all of this means and what they might want to consider as something different. So I don't know if it's a great use of your time.
So as we begin to close, we have a couple of minutes. Commissioner Stevens, do you have any lingering questions or final thoughts, perhaps?
I don't have any lingering questions. I'll just have a couple final thoughts. Just thank you for presenting this. It's certainly, interesting to see, what we're going to come up with kind of, but it's, I think it's good to look at this with fresh eyes and to have a refresh of this process. And, I think about, I don't know a lot about the persona method that you've introduced, but I think about, when we talk about workflow and stuff, like what makes sense is if we are able to free up space, who should, share space, and what does that look like? And can that even create innovations on its own of putting together groups that might not normally interact as much, but can really feed off of one another? And so I think that there's some really interesting opportunities to kind of relook at the way we do work. So this is not just about space, but it's really about efficiencies and potentially innovation. So I'm excited for, what comes next, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yeah, I think part of the purpose of it too is going to be just a real kind and gentle prod, right? For folks that would look and say, wow, that's a considerable difference than where we're headed. Let's take a fresh look. And so there's going to be value in that, and certainly in the workshops, but leading up to and after the fact as well. So.
I just wanted to say, Commissioner Stevens stated what I said. This could lead to innovative ways of workflow and doing things differently and breaking down silos and cross-department intersection and collaboration. And I just really appreciate this presentation today. I think this is really interesting, intriguing, and maybe a better way of thinking of how we use our space. But I also think this aligns and aligns with our climate smart goals and our climate and future ready about how we're trying to use space differently and maybe not have to create more space. So thank you, appreciate it.
Great.
So I'll wrap this up, and a couple of quick comments. One is, I think I very much resonate what I believe Commissioner Stevens started, and that is, how can this contribute to innovation? And also, sometimes different departments or different services are in silos. So can this be an opportunity to learn how that intersectionality, that we can really optimize that? An example would be, for yesterday in our administrative matters meeting, we had a variety of proclamations, and we had a variety of folks there. One of them having to do, for example, the behavioral health space, suicide prevention. And there were folks from, community justice alternatives, et cetera. So I think that's a really critical takeaway that hopefully you folks can develop. This might be a tremendous opportunity for limiting some of those silos that historically have been there. Secondly, I would appreciate a better understanding of this persona method. I still don't quite get it, and usually takes me once or twice to get something. Forgive me. And then finally, I saw that the Commissioner's office was in that one of the first slide, stakeholders. I presume your recommendations will include how we might use this space as effectively as possible. Is it, I
Yes.
presume that's correct?
Yes.
So then, excellent job, thank you, very helpful information. It's 2:30. If you have wisdom, I'm afraid we'll have to wait till next time. Thank you all very much at 2:30 PM.
Thank you.
We are adjourned.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I have a 2:30.
No worries, we understand. Do you want me to explain?